Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Colvin, and I'm the Public Programs Curator here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And today, I am so excited to welcome you to this, our final Alabama Women's History Series program. Before we begin today's program, I have a few quick announcements. The first is that, of course, this program series was created to complement our temporary exhibit, Justice Not Favor, Alabama Women and the Vote. But just as this is the final program in that series, our temporary exhibit will soon come down. So you have through next week to come see it in person here at the Department of Archives and History. But never fear, if you cannot make it here in person, we have scanned the exhibit and made it available to you online. You can see the link to our scanned exhibit on our Facebook page. I'd also like to go ahead and invite you next month to see our Food for Thought lecture. On Thursday, June 16th, here at the Archives, Joshua Burford will present on the Invisible Histories Project. Now, this is an organization whose entire purpose is to collect, preserve, and tell the history of LGBTQ plus people in the South. So I hope to see you out here on June 16th to hear Joshua speak, but it's also going to be live streamed here on our YouTube and Facebook channels. Without further ado, I am very excited to introduce you to Dr. Susan Youngblood Ashmore. Dr. Ashmore is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of History at Oxford College of Emory University. She's the author of Carry It On, The War on Poverty and the Civil Rights Movement in Alabama, and co-editor of Alabama Women, Their Lives and Time, which is available in our museum store and online in our museum store for purchase. And she also has an article in here on Lurleen Wallace, who we're going to hear more about today. So I'd like to welcome you, Dr. Ashmore.
All right, great. So good to see everyone, and really I want to thank Alex Colvin for the invitation to speak today and just for all her technical know-how and her patience. And thank you all who are here to spend your lunchtime with me today. I'm grateful. So just a little bit of heads up, since I'm discussing a campaign, there are many references to speeches and news reports. And so I thought it would be better to include some of those quotes. So normally I don't have a long quotes in a PowerPoint presentation, but for our purposes today, I thought it would be better so you all could follow along in that way. So, all right, so let's begin. Oh, and also thank you for giving our Alabama Women book such support. We're really grateful for that from the archives. All right, so today I will use the history of the 1966 primary for governor to reveal the ways Mrs. Wallace's gender and identity as a wife and mother appealed to voters who worried about the changing culture and their place in it. The 1966 governor's race took place at a crossroads in American politics. It was the first statewide election since the Voting Rights Act passed, enfranchising thousands of Black Alabamians, and the Wallace campaign constructed a narrative using the family and local values to counter the growing federal power that was altering Alabama's political world. Lurleen Wallace's inauguration on Monday, January 16, 1967, brought journalists from across the South reporting on this remarkable day of the third woman elected governor in American history. And you can see these two kind of like souvenirs from the inauguration. The photographs in this presentation all come from the archives, the Alabama Department of Archives and History. So you could see these yourselves, and maybe these are, I don't even know if they're in the exhibit, but you see here her button and clearly that she's running for governor so he can run for president. All right. So in her coverage of the day's events, Atlanta Constitution reporter Celestine Sibley fantasized that Lurleen would assert her independence of George. All the time he was using this pretty, seemingly mild little mother of 4 children to keep his hold on the state reign, she pointed out. Many people enjoyed the ironic thought that Lurleen, once in, would show him. Reflecting on the entire inauguration day, Sibley saw that those close to Lurleen's campaign already knew. The thing that convinced me that there is a lingering hope for the liberation of Lurleen, Sibley determined, is that she is obviously tough. Anybody who could stand for 6 hours and watch that inaugural parade the way she did plainly has physical stamina and a special kind of never-say-die mental strength. Atlanta's popular reporter was on to something, but Lurleen did not want liberation. She wanted respect. I wanted you to see a few pictures from the inauguration parade. There were floats. This was a car full of football players that was pulling a float. And here you can see an ROTC group with their bayonets ready. What appeared obvious on the Capitol steps that afternoon, that Lurleen Wallace was simply a stand-in for her husband and his political ambitions, concealed something more complicated. It had not been easy being married to George Wallace and raising their children while he chased his political dreams all over the state. Even though equal rights feminists existed in 1966, Lurleen Wallace was not one of them. She chose a different path. Like many other white women who grew up in Alabama's working class, full-time domesticity had been the ideal. When that turned out to be a frustrating mirage and a source of deep disappointment, she decided her best option was to make his ambition her ambition. Being the only person who could keep his presidential dream alive became a source of power for her in their marriage. She finally had something he needed, and she used that to its fullest capacity. Her experiences in post-war Alabama were typical of many women of her generation, which meant that her campaign style resonated with voters across the state. She used her identity as a wife and mother to full effect, and in the process became part of the burgeoning political transformation of a Deep South state that fought against the push for racial equality by moving instead to protect families from what many perceived to be an ever more powerful federal government. She created her own way in Wallace Country through the choices she made in her marriage, with her family, and most importantly, for herself. Lurleen's entree into the governor's race grew out of George Wallace's desire to remain politically relevant, to be taken seriously as a presidential candidate. At the time, the state constitution did not allow a sitting governor to serve a consecutive term in office, which put Wallace in a bind. Autumn brought bad news for both George and Lurleen. In October 1965, he failed to get approval from the Alabama Senate for a referendum amending the Alabama Constitution. And in November, Mrs. Wallace learned she had uterine cancer. In the days after her radiation treatment and before her hysterectomy, the First Lady faced some hard truths about her husband's ambition and some cold realities about her own determination to make her marriage work. Instead of acknowledging that she would have major surgery to remove a cancerous tumor, reports from the governor's office described her condition in vague terms and that it required only minor surgery. As the First Lady recuperated from her surgery, she contemplated the idea her husband raised of her running for governor. Sometime in February, Catherine Steinecker, the First Lady's assistant, remembered that George came to the mansion for lunch and told his wife that I've decided we're not going to run. We're going to get out of all this pressure. We're going back to Clayton when my term is up. Lurleen balked. Yes, George, we will run. I want to run, and I'll be disappointed if I can't. Using her sense of humor, she chided him. Now, George, if you want to sit up there in that Capitol and not help me campaign, well, okay, but I'm going to run. It is clear why the governor wanted his wife to run, but why would Lurleen Wallace want to hold this office? What was in it for her? Since his first run for the state legislature, she realized that politics for her husband was like oxygen for everyone else. Journalist Marshall Frady put it in stark terms. Beyond his political existence is nothingness, a white, empty, terrible blank. It's as if when the time finally arrives for him to cease being a politician, he will simply vanish, evaporate, cease to be. Wallace biographer Dan Carter observed that if she did not run, there was a chance her life with him would be more difficult because he could be unbearable outside the political fray. Others noted her deep love for her husband as a key influence on her decision. Bill Jones, Wallace's press secretary, said Mrs. Wallace told him she did it for George. I think another important reason she agreed to run for governor had to do with their marriage. As her daughter Peggy pointed out after Wallace's 1963 stand in the schoolhouse door, attempting to block the racial integration of the University of Alabama, Lurleen knew the simple life she wanted was no longer possible. Publicly, she took pride in her husband's accomplishments and probably believed as president he could turn the country around. Even Marshall Frady noticed Wallace's political gifts at this juncture. I began to realize that around Wallace there is that same air of limitless possibility, of excitement, of adventure, of incredible prospects, that same feeling that anything is possible. While she did not want to miss out on this presidential adventure, she could also see an opportunity closer to home for herself. What becomes clear as the campaign got underway, and even after Alabamians elected her governor, is that this decision became a personal stand for her in their marriage. Doing this for him shifted the balance of power in their relationship, not out of her own ambition to govern, but out of her own desire to have his respect. It had been a long, hard road since the day they signed their marriage license in Tuscaloosa on May 22, 1943. She took this opportunity to show George Wallace she could no longer be taken for granted. It is not an exaggeration to note that in February 1966, she was the only person in the world who could keep his national political aspirations alive. No one else could do this. Working as a team, she could hold his place in Alabama while he took his message beyond the state borders. After she announced her candidacy, critics came forward in the press describing Mrs. Wallace as her husband's pawn, his puppet, his stooge, and that he made her run for office. Her answer to these critics illustrated her own self-esteem. Of all the untruths I've read and heard about myself, she clarified to Birmingham News reporter Anita Smith, the thing that upsets me the most is to hear someone say George made me run. I don't believe in people being dominated, and George certainly doesn't dominate me. He didn't force me into this, she insisted. On February 24, 1966, Lurleen Wallace announced her candidacy from the podium in the Alabama House chamber to an audience packed with rowdy Wallace faithful from every county in the state, while her children and her husband looked on. And if you want to go to the link that I've provided here on the presentation, there is a recording of her making this announcement in the Alabama House chamber, if you want to watch that. As the only female candidate for governor in the nation during a time of rapid social change, the Wallace campaign had to walk a fine line to clarify Lurleen's validity as a contender for Alabama's highest office. Issues surrounding her gender quickly moved to the forefront of the campaign. She needed to be serious enough to be believable as the governor, but not too serious that voters could imagine her exploiting the power of the office for her own ambitions. She needed to be feminine enough to maintain her appeal to voters, but not too feminine that she came across as frivolous or sexy. The campaign chose to focus on Lurleen's appeal as a no-nonsense, down-to-earth wife and mother of four. In many ways, her gender became a magic coin that both Lurleen and George employed in their effort to assure Alabama voters that an unchanging world was still possible, while at the same time taking the unprecedented step outside the accepted boundary for a woman in politics. Her role as a wife and mother was one side of this coin that provided a new way to legitimize the ongoing fight with the federal government over racial equality. Her need for her number one assistant was the other side of the coin that kept her subordinate and confirmed his role as the state's patriarch, guiding and protecting the Southern traditions of states' rights and white supremacy that they and their supporters held dear. Her candidacy was a godsend for those Alabamians who feared the future based on what they saw in the news. A nation rocked by urban uprisings in the North and West, anti-war protesters demonstrating against the country's fight in Vietnam, and calls for Black power that federal voter registrars could make a reality in their own backyard. Throughout the primary and the general election, political cartoonists, journalists, candidates, and constituents used Lurleen's gender to criticize and mock, as well as to celebrate and affirm, hoping to sway public opinion. As she found a way for herself during this unusual campaign, finally gaining the respect she craved from her husband, she unwittingly contributed to the early development of a new political worldview that shifted the focus away from the push for equality and toward protecting families from the encroaching power of the federal government. Newspapers and magazines beyond Alabama took an immediate interest in Mrs. Wallace's run. Even before the couple kicked off their campaign in mid-March, 2 political cartoons revealed the dread many across the country felt that her bid for office would enable George Wallace to continue the political mischief-making he started in the presidential primaries of 1964. Art Poynter of the Detroit News depicted George Wallace at a carnival peddling Dr. Wallace's fabulous elixir in this political cartoon. Wallace is dressed as a salesman in a top hat and bow tie, holding up a bottle for sale, with a buxom Lurleen Wallace in a low-cut polka-dotted dress sitting on his knee as 3 bumpkins look on. The caption read, "New routine for an old Alabama snake oil show." On this same day, Paul Conrad of the Los Angeles Times drew a gender-bending cartoon that highlighted the extraordinary nature of the Alabama race and the anxiety it was creating. The drawing was of a couple arm in arm from the waist down, yet the man wore a dress and his hairy hand clutched a purse, while the woman wore pants and a suit jacket and her manicured fingers held a cigar. The caption read, "The Governor and Mr. George Wallace of Alabama." So you can see there's an indictment on both of them in this cartoon. After Mrs. Wallace won the May 3rd primary outright with 52% of the vote, Hugh Haney of the Louisville, Kentucky's Courier-Journal presented a grotesque image of George Wallace in drag. He transformed the couple into a man-woman named Georgette Wallace. The figure's head had George's face adorned by heavy makeup, long false eyelashes, and dark curly hair flowing beneath a perched Ku Klux Klan hood. His tight-fitting dress outlined large breasts and curvy hips accentuated by a sash tied with a bow in the back, and revealed hairy legs and platform heels with bows tied around each manly ankle. Polished claws poked out of his thick fingers. 3 strands of pearls around his neck and a handbag daintily held between his index finger and thumb completed the ensemble. The caption did not mince words. "The trend may be to darker shades, but in Alabama, honey, the lily white is still in vogue." While every one of these political cartoons obviously critiqued and insulted George Wallace, the context of each used gender to indict Lurleen as a co-conspirator. As the campaign gathered steam, many observers outside of Alabama recognized the populist ruse and refused to accept the Wallaces were merely allowing Alabamians to decide for themselves if a governor could serve 2 terms through a proxy candidate. National publications featured Lurleen Wallace in a variety of ways that conveyed her as either detached, aloof, or out of her league, and thus that the state, by extension, deserved its pariah status. Life magazine's Shayna Alexander piled on when she covered the National Governors Conference in Los Angeles that summer. Her article, "The Feminine Eye on the Lookout for Lurleen," mocked Alabama as a real-life version of Al Capp's Dog Patch. Who else but Daisy May would campaign on a promise to keep liquor out of the governor's mansion for the next 4 years? Alexander asked. Or consider Lurleen's big campaign promise that if elected, she will make my husband my #1 assistant. Shades of Sadie Hawkins Day. Describing Alabama's First Lady as small and rather mousy, the reporter continued by issuing more direct insults that painted all things Alabama as backward and out of style. Mrs. Wallace is not an easy woman to spot in a crowd. In contrast to the finery of some other woman, she looked defiantly drab, a peahen in a tropical aviary. When Alexander wondered what Lurleen had been doing all week, was she working on matters gubernatorial with her future colleagues, or was she going to sightsee with the governor's wives? Neither was the answer, which pointed out Mrs. Wallace's lack of political engagement. Instead of hobnobbing with other governors or getting to know their wives, Lurleen took the opportunity to visit Disneyland, the wax museum that featured movie stars, Knott's Berry Farm, and Marineland. Oblivious to Alexander's expectations of a serious candidate for governor, Lurleen came across as a naif, exploring a new world. She told the reporter, "I just love anything of or pertaining to water." She told the reporter she had fun being kissed by a seal and seeing the tremendous whale that weighs so much and jumps so high. Even when Alexander conceded that Mrs. Wallace turned out to be a frail woman in a rough spot doing a good job, it was a backhanded compliment. In closing her article, the journalist told Lurleen she appeared more confident in person than she did when Alexander saw her on television in the spring. The First Lady reassured the reporter the way she would back home in Alabama. "It wasn't being governor that bothered me. I knew I was fortunate enough to have an experienced man as my assistant. It was those TV cameras. You know, I still don't like those cameras. But about being governor, I have no reservations about that at all." Ladies' Home Journal, with its masthead, "Never underestimate the power of a woman," asked all the wives of the nation's governors to respond to this question: how do you think the candidacy of Mrs. Lurleen Wallace for governor of Alabama will affect the dignity of American womanhood and the dignity of the institution of the state government? The September issue featured the response of Lucille Smiley, First Lady of Idaho, titled "Why I Feel Sorry for Lurleen Wallace and Alabama." She explained that Lurleen's candidacy could not be taken seriously because it was an effort to circumvent the Constitution of Alabama. It troubled her that the four Wallace children were learning the wrong thing from their father's grab of power. Smiley worried, what would happen if she were elected and then he died? If that came about, she predicted Alabama would be in jeopardy because she cannot possibly have the knowledge that such a job requires. In the end, she chastised the Wallaces and the people of Alabama as being almost un-American. "I could not bring myself to do what she is doing. My husband would not ask me to do it, and even if he wanted to do anything like that, the people of our state would not stand for it. I wish the people of Alabama felt the same way." These critiques from outside Alabama assumed that a national standard for political integrity existed across the country, that each state's democratic tradition should uphold. However, by 1966, a siege mentality embraced white Alabamians that supported a different standard of political virtue. For the Wallace administration, the traditional rules of democracy no longer applied under the current state of emergency. While it is clear there was a national audience concerned about the Wallace campaign, the scrutiny of the national press in the end did not damage the First Lady's appeal among Wallace supporters. In fact, it might have strengthened it instead. George Wallace used these insults as political fodder to garner support for his wife from those who also felt abused and misunderstood by the national press every day. Casting a vote for Lurleen could serve as one way to express your own outrage. Despite the way the national press portrayed Lurleen Wallace, she would define herself to the only audience that mattered to her, as she and her husband sought votes across Alabama in the spring and fall of 1966. When they kicked off the campaign at a rally in Montgomery's Municipal Auditorium on March 18th, it was the largest audience Mrs. Wallace had ever addressed. That night, she set the tone for what would follow over the course of the campaign. To get the crowd's enthusiasm going, she opened with this statement: "Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Alabamians, we are willing to let the people speak." She denied that Alabamians had anything to be ashamed of. "My husband and I are proud of Alabama. We want to help keep our state on the upswing. We want to continue working for a better way of life for all Alabamians today and for our children's future. And we want to continue to stand up for Alabama throughout this nation." She used the words "we" and "our" 17 times over the course of her short address, joining herself to her husband's record, implying that they had been a team all along. And she reassured the crowd that her decision to run for governor was made with enthusiasm and determination. Lurleen's modesty and self-denial came through when she made it perfectly clear that she was grateful to be the instrument whereby you, the people of Alabama, have the opportunity to express yourselves on the record compiled by the Wallace administration. After highlighting her husband's accomplishments as governor, she used coded language to acknowledge her dismay with the way the federal government enforced new civil rights laws. Our administration will continue to speak out over this country against the trends that threaten to destroy the local government and free enterprise systems upon which it was founded. She closed by reminding everyone that George Wallace would be ever present if they elected her governor. I ask you to cast your vote for me on May 3rd. My pledge to you is I will continue with my husband's help to provide the same kind of state government you have experienced in the last 3 years. We want to continue to stand up for Alabama. The crowd's adulation carried Lurleen away from her frustrating days of sitting at home raising her children alone while her husband ignored his family. Others in the campaign observed that after her announcement, even George was nicer to her. Glenn Curley remembered that she would call her husband at the Capitol. He would ask, "What the hell you want? I'm busy now. Don't be bothering me." When their campaign began, Curley noticed he's even talking sweet to her on the phone now. Perhaps this night energized her in new ways that enabled her to set aside fears about her health and look forward to an immediate future of meeting people across the state. The Wallaces usually campaigned as a couple as they crisscrossed the state, although they each traveled in separate cars. It took a great deal of stamina to run for statewide office. Often they would attend 4 or 5 rallies in one day, beginning at 10 and wrapping up by 8. Closer to Election Day, there were also large nighttime rallies. Colonel E.C. Dotard, who oversaw security for the Wallace campaign, provided some perspective. But it was quite a bit of stress on her to get up and make 5 speeches a day with a rally at night, and that was all through the 67 counties. It was tiring to me, and back then I was about 35 years old, and I was exhausted, and I didn't make a speech. But her sense of humor kept her going. She'd laugh and never complain. I could see that she was exhausted, though. I would go in the motel at night, and she could barely walk up the steps. She was so tired. Continuing a tradition he started in 1962 campaign, Wallace liked to hold these events outside. Oscar Harper explained that people come to hear you outside when they won't go inside because they would have to dress up to do that. In small towns, the crowd might be 50 to 100 people. Events in larger cities drew thousands. Wallace supporters came to rallies in their old pickup trucks and late model Chevrolets, Fords, and Pontiacs. The curious turned out in their overalls, work khakis, and business suits, in their house dresses, hair curlers, and Sunday best. They were old, middle-aged, teenagers, and children. In Selma, several school teachers even marched their elementary classes to the courthouse square, joining the crowd of more than 5,000 to hear the Wallaces speak. So you can see in this picture the variety of people. That you can see a woman in her hair curlers. You can just see the attention they're giving, but it's a real variety of folks. This is a nighttime rally. And these are from contact sheets from a photographer that are in the archives here. Wallace bumper stickers could be seen on hat brims, boys' football helmets, and wrapped around little children's heads. The campaign even sold white clip-on ties with Lurleen's smiling face looking out. Here's some more children. Sometimes people brought homemade signs with them, "Bib for Wallace" or "We want Wallace." And this man's sign says, "U.S. Wallace people had rather fight than switch," which is really a play on a cigarette ad that he reworked to be in the Wallace campaign. "Come on over to the LNG side." Along Alabama's back roads, handmade signs nailed to telephone poles and fence posts warned, "This is Wallace Country." They look like posted signs trying to keep out change. Confederate symbols abounded at all the events. The flatbed trailer on wheels that served as a traveling stage often parked near the courthouse square under the watchful gaze of the town's Confederate monument. The Confederate battle flag waved on the end of the stage, and a country and western band played Dixie to signal the Wallaces to the stage. Someone usually marked the podium with a Wallace Country license plate that featured portraits of Lurleen and George on a background of the Southern Cross. You can see it here in the picture. Retail Politics Alabama Style was the name of the campaign game. At these rallies, usually a local dignitary or politician would make some remarks, as Richard Beard of Trussville did when he vouched for Lurleen's qualifications. Gendered language got peppered throughout these events, reinforcing Lurleen's proper place to mitigate the fact that she sought Alabama's highest office. So here's what Richard Beard said in Trussville. The lady who accompanies him is thoroughly familiar with the office which she seeks, and having been associated very closely with an outstanding administration of her husband, it is my pleasure at this time to present to you the next governor of Alabama, Mrs. Lurleen Wallace, and also the next president of the United States, George C. Wallace. Like a warm-up act before the headliner appeared, Lurleen spoke about any accomplishments the Wallace administration had made in the area, such as roads improved, bridges built, or junior colleges opened. Next, she issued dire warnings while assuring the crowd that the Wallaces were paying close attention. Our administration will continue to voice over the country the need for an awakening to the dangers of the trends that unless checked, will destroy all local government, the property ownership system, and individual liberty and freedom. Then she pledged to continue what the Wallace administration started so they could stand up for Alabama. Finally, she closed by saying, "May I now present to you the man who will be my #1 assistant, my husband and governor, George C. Wallace," which cued the band to play another round of Dixie. Lurleen then took her place in a chair on the corner of the stage to listen attentively to her husband speak. So you can see her here sitting as he's speaking and how she's looking very attentive to his words. She admitted to a reporter in Talladega that this type of speaking is new to me. I've even given talks at luncheons before, that kind of thing, but that's the little experience I've had with it. I don't pretend to be the speaker the governor is, so of course I don't speak as long. Lurleen's honesty drew people to her, and over the course of the campaign, she rehearsed her speeches with her children and her friends, and improved her speaking style as crowds appeared to respond to her on the stump. Her confidence grew. Once George took the stage, throughout the next 30 or 45 minutes, his speeches could tap into a full gamut of emotions: flattery, humor, fear, anger, and violence. He talked to crowds as if they were all old friends, making them feel good about themselves. And if you elect my wife the governor of this state, we'll be able to continue to stand up in places all over our country and say this: I come from a state whose people are just as refined and cultured and intelligent and righteous as people in any state of this union, and don't you ever forget it. He would often mention how a national or Alabama big city newspaper had insulted him, and then he would say, "You see what they are trying to do to us?" That connected those in the crowd to the slap in the face he received. In Fairfield, he brought up the Newsweek and the Life magazine, and the national press were there. They made fun of me, they made fun of you. The big newspapers say you got to change your image. Well, we don't got to change any such thing. Sometimes he told jokes, bringing up the Little Abner insult from Shana Alexander's piece in Life magazine. He told those listening that a national magazine had referred to Alabamians as dog patch folks because of the way we dressed. Well, I want to tell you something. The woman that wrote that article, I wished you could have seen what she was wearing. Often he liked to bring up ways Lurleen's opponents had offended her, and in the tradition of Southern patriarchy, how they had, by extension, insulted all Alabama women who he would avenge. For example, Bob Gilchrist, a candidate for governor who was also one of the state senators who stopped the secession bill, told people at one of his rallies that Governor Wallace wrapped himself in a skirt and a bonnet to stay in power. The governor then twisted those words at Wallace events into a form of violent language. My opponents say they don't want no skirt for governor of Alabama. That's right, no skirt. Well, I want you to know I resent that slur on the women of this state. In the general election, he continued to use rough language to indict his wife's opponent, Republican Jim Martin. At a speech in Jefferson County towards the end of the campaign, the governor said, "In the spring, Bobby Kennedy came to Alabama to speak against my wife. That was a tough obstacle to overcome, but we finally overcame it." The crowd must have loved the way he manipulated the well-known civil rights refrain, "We shall overcome," in his reference to overcoming an insult from Bobby Kennedy. Now, he told the crowd, the national Republicans have come to Alabama to try to beat my wife. He could have used other words that did not imply violence against Lurleen, like defeat or triumph over or prevail. He was a master at using just the right word to arouse those listening who understood what he was enjoining them to do. A vote for Lurleen is a vote to protect white womanhood. He closed this rally with more fighting words, noting that in papers all over the country, "We, the people of Alabama, are going to hurt the leaders of both the national parties." That is the point of it all. We are going to hurt the leaders in both of these national parties because they have hurt us enough all through the years. At all these events and in official campaign publications, George and Lurleen appeared like a happy couple, almost an Alabama version of political celebrities like John and Jackie Kennedy. Political advertisements even noted they celebrated their 21st wedding anniversary, May 22, 1964. In the world of Alabama politics, Lurleen's composure and respectability contrasted with George's low-down, defiant style, and through their differences, they validated each other to a wide cross-section of Alabamians. After their rallies, each circulated through the crowd, shaking hands and engaging people one-on-one. Although George was known for never forgetting a person he met while on the hustings, in photograph contact sheets, Lurleen can also be seen enjoying up-close encounters with voters, bending down to speak to a small child, leaning close to make eye contact with an elderly woman, holding a man's hand in both of hers as she listened attentively. Sometimes people hug Lurleen or put their arms around her shoulders or waist, obviously wanting to express how they felt about her. Their supporters could laugh, cheer, and ultimately vote for them because doing so became a way to defy the authority of their own state constitution, the national political parties, and especially the federal government that had altered their racial world in so many ways. They could delight in George's uncouth and violent ways and at the same time support his nice wife, who stayed in her place while she helped the people of Alabama have their say. Since this was the first statewide election after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the Wallace campaign had to figure out alternative ways to maintain the Southern tradition of white supremacy that could reassure their supporters in a time of expanding citizenship rights and still appeal to a national audience as the governor took his message beyond Alabama. In 1966, when the Wallaces discussed racial segregation, they claimed they were not racists. When a reporter asked Mrs. Wallace if she feared for her husband's safety when the Selma March reached Montgomery, she said she disagreed when her husband got labeled as a racist. She told the journalist matter-of-factly, "We believe in segregation, but have at heart the interests of all the people. We feel the state should handle racial matters." When George Wallace told Marshall Frady that the Birmingham papers wanted to make a deal with me, said they would support me if I got off this racism business, he revealed that in his opinion, supporting segregation did not mean he was a racist. "Well, hell, I ain't never made a racist speech in my life. And what they were talking about was segregation anyway, not racism," he said. Each minimized the reality of their bigotry, claiming segregation was in the best interest of all the people. A familiar vocabulary joined a new narrative in this campaign that would be picked up by other conservative forces across the country as the decade progressed. The Wallaces named their approach the Alabama Movement, signaling a clear contrast to the Civil Rights Movement and hoping to garner recruits to Wallace's presidential run as a force to hold back change. When George Wallace expressed his gratitude to people who came out to see them, he said, "I want to thank you for your support for our movement." He continued to call for states' rights as a way to stop integration. We are going to see some changes made in this country, and we are going to see more folks say, let's turn the schools back to the states. Let's turn the hospitals and the labor unions and the businesses back to people of the respective states. He spoke out against the new guidelines issued by the Federal Health, Education, and Welfare Agency to get more public schools integrated, by describing the intrusive reach of the federal government's power in the most outrageous way. They want to transfer your chillum 10 miles over in another county to conduct social experiments on them. If you got a book that says Robert E. Lee was a good man and the Confederate flag was a symbol of honor, they can put in books saying that Robert E. Lee was bad, a vulgar man, and the Confederate flag was a symbol of dishonor. In other ways, the governor used the Alabama movement to discuss the need for a third party, because to him, the two national parties were both ultra-liberal. He reminded them that it was national Republicans who got the bayonets in your backs in Little Rock, and the national Democrats who put the bayonets in the backs at Oxford, meaning Oxford, Mississippi. This was his standard Wallace speak going back to the early 1960s that his supporters expected to hear from him. At a rally in Birmingham just before the primary vote, he warned, "You can't have a return to local government by talking to ourselves." He wanted to talk to other regions against such things as the Voting Rights Act, because he thought it gave illiterates more rights in Alabama than in most other states. In all of these examples, the events Wallace referred to involved African Americans seeking their constitutional rights, but he could use words like Little Rock or Oxford and illiterates to imply the Alabama movement wanted to stop racial integration in many facets of American society. In her own style, Mrs. Wallace lent credibility to this counterforce in the way she reasoned with those who listened at a campaign rally just before Election Day, offering issues beyond race that could help Alabamians feel good about themselves. When many sections of the country have been brainwashed into feeling that it is out of style to be patriotic, Alabama said, no, patriotism is still in style. When many apparently thought there is something wrong with prayer in the public schools, Alabama said, no, this nation was founded on a belief in God. Otherwise, there would be no public schools. She upheld Alabama traditions as timeless, American customs that justified there was no need for change. When misguided young people in other sections burned their draft cards, the young people of Alabama said, no, our nation today deserved defense against any enemy just as in times past. They responded by donating blood, by answering the call to arms, and by sacrificing their lives. More than 160 young men from Alabama have given their lives in Vietnam. They, like the thousands who have made the supreme sacrifice before them, were old-fashioned. Although they fought with modern weapons, their courage was the same as the pioneer who carved this nation from the wilderness. All the examples she used bypassed what her husband had become famous for, saying no to racial integration. Through speeches like this, the First Lady provided a way for Alabamians, who had been shamed nationally for their violent and obstructionist reactions against the Black freedom struggle, to be proud of themselves instead. The First Lady noted, "We intend to set the style, regardless of what may be the popular trend. Alabamans have the courage and the fortitude to lead the way, to set the example, to do what is right rather than try to do what is expected." She was the perfect vehicle for this message, since she had been mocked and criticized herself for basically being an out-of-date citizen of Dogpatch. In so doing, we have become leaders, she reassured the crowd. We have provided a rallying point for millions of Americans. We have cleared the spot for rebuilding the fire of patriotism. Alabama and Alabamians have always led in the defense of our native land, and we have gladly taken whatever role was given us, and we have stood every test. For her, the people of Alabama had no need to alter their ways. Instead, she called for the nation to look south and be inspired by Alabama's example. We will again meet the challenge before us. We will not quit our beliefs for the sake of fleeting popularity. We will not sacrifice our principles for the praise of editors. We are with you in this fight, and you are with us. She was able to turn the tables on who could claim loyalty to the nation in a manner that widened the Wallace appeal. As the day of reckoning neared, the Wallace campaign hoped it had done its job. Now it came down to voter turnout. The work of federal voter registrars had increased the number of Black voters to unprecedented levels. 235,000 African Americans had registered to vote, and many were anxious to cast their ballots and express themselves as full citizens. The governor tried to counter this surge in potential Black voters by getting more white Alabamians registered. He turned to chapters of the White Citizens Council to conduct voter registration drives. Wallace also permitted the Sovereignty Commission to use $3,750 in state funds to print pamphlets urging white people to register to vote. The commission distributed these pamphlets exclusively to white children who attended segregated public schools, with the idea that these children would bring the information home to their parents. Just days before the vote, U.S. Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach reminded Alabama election officials that they had the responsibility to assist illiterate voters in casting their ballots. And on Monday, May 2nd, the Attorney General announced on national television that he had sent several hundred federal observers to 7 Alabama counties to check on any discrimination against voters. His actions were necessary to protect the new voting rights of Black Alabamians, but this also led white Alabamians who were angry about these changes to head to the polls come rain or shine. While it was clear a new day had dawned on May 3rd, 180,000 African Americans cast ballots that day. Their expression of citizenship got drowned by 750,000 white voters. On the ballot that day, 10 candidates sought the Democratic nomination for governor. Lurleen's own name did not appear on the ballot. Instead, it listed her as Mrs. George C. Wallace, even though women who ran for other offices, like Mrs. Agnes Baggett, Melba Till Allen, and Mabel Amos, used their given names. Clearly, the campaign wanted no one to mistake Lurleen as an independent woman running for governor. The name on the ballot made clear she was a stand-in for George Wallace. That evening, the Wallace campaign and their faithful supporters gathered at Montgomery's Jefferson Davis Hotel to watch the vote tallies come in. An excited announcer read the returns from county after county and shouted, "The South shall rise again." After officials counted all the votes cast, Lurleen carried every county except 6, Bullock, Greene, Hale, Macon, Sumter, and Wilcox, all in the Black Belt that went for Richmond Flowers, who ran by courting African American voters. And she won 371,256 votes. Flowers, her nearest rival, got 134,150 votes. Earning 52% of the vote meant there would be no runoff, something Lurleen could not have imagined back in February when she announced she would join the race. It satisfied her that she earned 164,000 more votes than her husband had when he ran for governor in 1962, and that she carried counties that had been troublesome for him: Jefferson, Madison, Etowah, Morgan, and Lauderdale, all in North Alabama. George Wallace told those gathered, "The good spirit of Alabama has prevailed," and that his wife won the nomination outright because we have voiced the people's feelings. When the winner took the microphone, she said, "We will continue to stand up for Alabama. We renew our pledge to continue the type of government which apparently has been endorsed today." She also reassured the crowd that if elected in November, the dual role of governor and mother would not create any problems. None of this would have been possible if Mrs. Wallace had not become a believable candidate over the course of the spring campaign. Her speaking style improved as the weeks passed. In April, she campaigned on her own when George got sick, and as crowds grew larger and larger, she spoke to them confidently. The timing of the election was also crucial to her success. The movement for women's liberation was in its early stages in 1966, as heralded by the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that included sex and its ban on discrimination. Yet by the next gubernatorial election in 1970, it would have been inconceivable for a woman to run for governor only as her husband's proxy because of the advances made by second-wave feminism. She also won because the Wallace campaign nurtured and utilized the siege mentality that gripped the state, convincing white voters that the Wallaces could continue to fight against change. During the storm created by the candidate and the governor, the messages of the other Democratic candidates did not gain much ground, and they never really had a chance in the crowded field. The editors of the Birmingham News took Mrs. Wallace's primary victory hard, stating that voters had an emotional fling that changed reality not one whit. They encouraged Alabamians to take a breath, hoping the May primary was only a form of letting off steam. The big city editors asked voters to substitute reason for emotion in their political decision-making. In their analysis, the outcome of the Democratic primary was the result of extremism at the federal level, where every action has seemed calculated to feed the fires of resentment in the South, and extremism at the state level, where George Wallace had been only too ready to fan the flames. They closed with a plea. People of the state in the next 6 months need to stop and think rationally, as objectively as possible, about the course they will chart for themselves in November. Blind defiance is a poor basis on which to lay foundation for Alabama's future. There must be constructive thought and action. Despite this post-primary analysis, what became clear with each vote in this election season was that Lurleen Wallace kept George Wallace's future political possibilities alive and gained his respect in the process. And that's the end.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashmore, for that wonderful presentation about Lurleen Wallace and her primary campaign. It really is something for us to think about as primaries are going on around us, around the nation. This is a time now we have for a question and answer. So if any of our audience members has a question, feel free to put it in the comments and we'll be able to share it directly with Dr. Ashmore and she can answer it. And we actually do have a question here that's already come in from Sarah Walker Carmack. Did the Wallaces on this campaign ever talk about actual or specific planks or platform issues? So is there issues that they were really focused on during the campaign?
I think it was focused on getting reelected, but they never really, other than holding back change and fighting against the federal government, that was their main platform. And then pushing for him to run for president. So it was kind of a dual track, and making those issues around the power of the federal government then reached beyond states that were dealing with issues around the civil rights movement. So that's what I've gathered from the research I've done. Yeah.
So it was kind of reacting more to that civil rights movement than introducing any new really platform or planks.
And using that coded language about the federal government and its overreach. And in her speeches where you could see she was questioning prayer in school being removed and these other great society issues that they wanted to counter. Yeah.
And so this is all kind of also linked in my mind. And you talked about how Lurleen did the sum, and I'm interested to see how prevalent it was. But in our exhibit right now, we have this wall where we're talking about women becoming involved in politics. It's called the Changing Voices. So, they get the right to vote, they become citizens, and then they're entered into office. And one of the things we have is a litter bag by Agnes Baggett, where she's talking and she's campaigning for state treasurer. And this is after she's already held this constitutional office and others. But on it, it says housewifey politician. And so really emphasizing that, not her experience, not this, but really emphasizing the imagery. And you spoke about how Lurleen was constantly kind of bringing up her husband's role in her and as also her role in domesticity. Why, can you expand on why that was an important imagery to use in Alabama? And also, is this something happening across the South? Is it across the nation at this time? Why is that the thing to emphasize?
I think for her, she's trying to not look like this is about her own ambition.
Mm-hmm.
I think that especially in Alabama in the mid 1960s, the feminist movement is not acceptable. And she is highlighting, again, things will stay the same. This isn't about her ambition. It's about supporting her husband. But the fact that there were some women who would still have their given names to vote for them, you see it's in flux, that it's in with Mrs. Wallace being Mrs. George Wallace, and then Mrs. Amos or Baggett, they're using their full names. But I also think maybe in the example from your exhibit, it also might be that courting women voters, that you have practical knowledge as the keeper of a home, balancing the family checkbook, keeping the budget for the family. So maybe that treasurer kind of used those things to highlight that women bring something to the table, but not necessarily anti-woman type characteristics. But Lurleen was definitely in that mode. And when you think about what she's known for as governor, visiting the mental hospital, at Bryce Hospital and Partlow, that took a lot of courage. She didn't have somebody come ahead of time. She saw the place at its worst. Her minister went with her. One of her friends went with her. But that's also fits in a mode of a womanly, caring about others and wanting to fix something like that in the state. And then the other thing she did that wasn't so successful was she gave a speech against school integration. And there were so many mistakes in the speech, and it was, you could see she was out of her league doing that. And then when she's only really governor for about 5 months, and then her cancer comes back. And then she spends the rest of her time fighting her disease. And then that whole way she dealt with her cancer so publicly, I do think left a legacy that encouraged people to get their doctors to tell them what's really wrong. And so she leaves that legacy too. Yeah.
So that's kind of a more personal history of her legacy, but a little bit more on her time as governor, because she is the first female governor. But it's such a short period of time. In that short tenure, what do you think is her greatest legacy of what she did as a politician?
Yeah, I would say that visit to Bryce Hospital in Partlow opens the door to it. People have known that it had problems all along. It's not like nobody knew this, but she's shining a light on it anew. And then by 1972, when the Wyatt v. Stickney lawsuit is filed, and then the Supreme Court affirms that, and that's Judge Johnson is part of that, you then see a big push to deal with those problems. It takes years to dismantle what was wrong in Bryce Hospital and Partlow. But her visit, I wouldn't say it changed the world, but it opened the door and it publicized, and she's remembered for that. And even in her inaugural address, she mentions people in the mental hospitals. And to me, it's a way they can care about somebody and it not be about African Americans and their lack of rights. These are maybe some people all Alabamians can feel good about helping. I don't know. That's kind of my early analysis. But I would say that, and then her way she dealt with her cancer are the two legacies, but not any real big laws passed or big changes made.
She didn't really have, I guess, the time to really be able to make a lot of those changes.
Or the interest, I don't think.
Yeah. That is very true. There's that too, of whether that was what her point was even going into this, or if it was just kind of maintaining the status quo, trying to kind of hold on to that.
And I don't know if I have a minute more to say something.
Oh, yes. So yeah, of course. Yes.
One of the interesting things, and if you read my article that's in the Alabama Women book, when she's governor, she some people sent her a rolling pin from Tennessee, carved from Andrew Jackson's trees or something. But she keeps that on the desk, and that is a symbol that women have used down through the ages as a weapon. And then she kept her name on the desk as well as her husband's. But then he had an office where his name really wasn't even on the door. And when she was gone, he would go into his old office, her office, and use her phone. And he would shave in that bathroom in there. And then she would arrive the next day, and then she would call security detail to remove his shaving gear and put it in the other bathroom. So there's this back and forth in their marriage that she's using this office to remind him she's governor, and he isn't. And she even gave him an apron at a public event, and told him he could be the one who handles the like wildflowers, like Lady Bird Johnson did for Lyndon Johnson. So there's some of that marriage digging that I really think was all about what this was for, gaining his respect.
Yeah, kind of turning it on its head. But like I said, I mean, I find the connections, and this is more just an observation I'm making now at the end of this exhibit, just even the connection all the way back to women getting involved in the progressive era, women getting involved in the suffrage movement, in the anti-suffrage movement. You see women gaining their political voice, but still trying to work it within this idea of domesticity and where women's place is. Right. And so I'm kind of wondering, I guess, then, and this is maybe beyond the scope of what you've looked at, is after Lurleen Wallace, is something in her reaching that high office, do you think anything changes in Alabama about women breaking through and saying it's no longer about that imagery? Is it then trying to have the ambition, or is that something that comes later? Is that wanting the office because you want it is enough?
I think that isn't part of her legacy, because this was just to help her husband. She didn't really have ambitions to be governor. And when she's governor, the things she does that she cares about, like the visiting the hospital, are handled in a way differently from the speech she gives fighting against the guidelines. She's so out of her league, it's embarrassing. And she wasn't embarrassed, or Wallace wasn't, but as a historian reading it, you can see she doesn't really know what she's talking about, and she's just out there reading whatever they put in front of her. So her governorship is maybe it's breaking the glass ceiling in a sense, but I'm not sure she's bringing other women along with her.
Exactly.
That follow.
So that's something that's it's a whole separate article, a whole separate thing.
And maybe only in Alabama in the mid-60s, with a white woman married to George Wallace, and the way she framed some of these speeches. And she's mocked by others, so they can relate to being mocked as Alabamians. There's a way she's carrying the state's image, and trying to defy it through her own actions. Yeah.
It's that very complex push and pull that we see. And again, if people can make it to the exhibit, that's almost the entire exhibit, is that push and pull between progress and status quo, and keeping and maintaining, but also trying to break through in certain ways. And so thank you, because this is one of the best ways we could end this series, is talking about this woman, as you said, who breaks this glass ceiling, and yet at the same time, there's a limit to it. And so there has to be another generation that comes after her that takes it to the next stage. And that is really, as we looked at the history of women and women's equality and suffrage in Alabama, that is the story, is starting here with a movement, but then generations picking it up, and that generations have to cross the color line as well, in order to achieve true equality.
And you can see that same, the civil rights movement is going on parallel to what Lurleen Wallace is doing in 66, and they're in conflict, and that Black people gaining their rights she, as a woman running for high office, but they're not allies. She's using them as a way to protect the state from all of this change. And so it shows us, and some of this resonated with where we are today politically, as we see a lot of reversals starting to happen that we thought were permanent. And so you can see how the claims she was making to resonate beyond the region get picked up by conservative politicians, and then the Wallaces were doing that, others copy it, and it becomes about the federal government's power instead of the rights being denied African Americans.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming and bringing all of this into our minds, and so we can all be thinking about this. And like I said, it was a great way to end this series. This has been, if everyone can go back to YouTube and you can watch all of the Alabama Women's History series from the beginning to this, everything from Progressive Era to here to Lurleen Wallace. And even though we are ending the series with that complements the exhibit, that doesn't mean we're going to stop talking about women and their role in Alabama history, because as we learned today, they have this complex and very important role in politics, in society, and in all aspects of Alabama history. So thank you so much, Dr.
Yeah, thank you for including me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank y'all to everyone. And I hope to see y'all on June 16th for Food for Thought. Awesome. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.